The boarding line moved in uneven pulses, a slow crawl punctuated by bursts of chatter and the clatter of carry-ons thumping into seatbacks. Overhead bins slammed shut and popped open again, flight attendants maneuvering with forced grace down the narrow aisle. Their smiles polished and identical until their eyes landed on certain passengers who didn't quite fit the usual pattern. In row 9, seat C, a woman sat with her shoulders drawn in, her head slightly bowed beneath the shadow of a navy hoodie. The hood was pulled far enough forward to obscure much of her face. She wore plain, faded jeans and scuffed sneakers, no jewelry, no makeup, nothing to hint at wealth or vanity. In her lap rested a weathered leather messenger bag that looked like it had logged more miles than most of the passengers combined. One strap was frayed, the brass clasp dulled to a greenish patina. The business class crowd noticed her immediately, not because she was loud or strange, but because she didn't match the tailored, passport-stamped polish of everyone else in the forward cabin. A man in a slate gray suit paused in the aisle beside row 9, his cologne pushing ahead of him like a declaration. He glanced at her, then at his boarding pass, then at the seat placard overhead. "I think you might be in the wrong section," he said, his tone casual but edged with assumption. "Economy is back there." He gestured down the aisle without looking where his hand pointed, already moving to pass her by. She didn't speak, just slid one pale hand out from beneath her hoodie, holding up her boarding pass without raising her eyes. He took it with a faint smirk, scanning it quickly before returning it. "Huh," he said. "Guess you are in the right place." He moved on, but not without a faint shake of his head. As more passengers filed in, the whispers began low. Clipped exchanges between travelers in pressed shirts and manicured hands. One woman across the aisle leaned toward her companion, lips barely moving. "How does someone dressed like that end up in business?" The other shrugged, eyes narrowing. The woman in row 9 seemed unaffected. She reached into her messenger bag, withdrawing a slim, weather-beaten booklet bound with a rubber band. Its pages were cream-colored with age, corners dog-eared, edges smudged with fingerprints. She cracked it open with careful hands, shielding the contents from prying eyes. Inside were lines, angles, and blocks of number charts and codes arranged in patterns no one else would have recognized. She studied them with the focus of someone tracing a familiar path in their mind, her thumb marking one page as she flipped to another. A flight attendant came down the aisle, smiling at each passenger in turn, asking perfunctory questions about stowing luggage. When her gaze fell on row 9, the smile faltered, just for a breath. Her eyes flicked to the name printed on the manifest in her hand. The crease between her brows deepened. Without breaking stride, she tapped her radio and murmured something low enough that only the tiny earpiece caught it. A crackle of static answered her before she moved on, her voice light again for the next passenger. The engines outside rumbled faintly as cargo doors shut. But in row 9, the air felt still like the pause before turbulence. The climb had been steady, almost soothing. The twin engines roared on takeoff, vibrating through the floor and into the bones of every passenger before softening into the deep, constant hum of a long-haul cruise. The lights dimmed after the meal service, shades pulled down across most windows as the cabin settled into its usual rhythm-sporadic conversation, the muted clink of glassware. The occasional chime from the crew call button. In row 9, seat C, she hadn't touched the dinner tray. Her messenger bag rested against her shin, and her hood was still drawn, though not enough to hide the faint fog her breath left on the glass. One hand traced invisible arcs in the condensation, movements small and precise, like someone marking coordinates on a map only she could see. An hour in, the first ripple of unease passed through the aircraft, a jolt, abrupt and sharp, that rattled trays and jolted a few heads from their naps. A heartbeat later, the seatbelt sign lit up with its polite chime. Most passengers obeyed without question, though a few exchanged curious glances. The woman in row 9 sat very still, her hand resting lightly on the armrest, eyes narrowing slightly. Flight attendants appeared in the aisle, their smiles a little too rigid now, hands brushing over the tops of seats as they steadied themselves. They moved in pairs, pausing every so often to murmur in low voices no passenger could quite catch. Then came the smell, faint at first, but unmistakable. A man 2 rows back frowned upward, tapping the shoulder of a passing attendant. "Hey, is that smoke?" His voice carried just far enough for others to hear, their heads turning in unison toward the overhead panel above him. Wisps of something pale curled from the seam where plastic met metal, dissolving in the pressurized air. The PA system clicked alive. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice began, calm but clipped, each word chosen with precision. "We're experiencing a minor systems issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Our crew is trained for this and will keep you updated." The line went dead without the usual soft reassurance or wry humor captains like to employ. The calm cracked when the aircraft dipped once, sharply enough to send a drink cart rolling into a seatback. Liquid splashed onto the aisle carpet. A child somewhere forward began to cry, the sound rising in pitch as the plane lurched again. An overhead bin popped open, spilling a jacket into the aisle. A hollow bang echoed above row 7 as an oxygen mask compartment rattled against its latch, but it didn't open. More passengers started to murmur, their voices rising toward panic. The hum of the engine sounded different, now strained, uneven. It was then that the cockpit door cracked open, just a sliver, and a tall figure stepped into the aisle. The co-pilot scanned the cabin with quick, searching eyes. He didn't linger on anyone until his gaze found row 9. His expression tightened, his posture snapping into something almost formal. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying over the low murmur of unease. "The captain requests your presence. Code name, Kestrel." The words fell into the air like a stone into still water, sending ripples down the aisle. Passengers looked from the co-pilot to the hooded woman, confusion and curiosity cutting through their fear. She didn't move at first. Then, with deliberate slowness, she uncurled her fingers from the armrest and rose, the messenger bag slipping over her shoulder as she stepped into the narrow aisle without a word. For a long, taut moment after the co-pilot spoke, no one in row 9 moved. The passengers nearest her glanced from her to him, bewildered, as though some private joke had been sprung in the middle of an emergency. The sharply dressed man from earlier let out a derisive snort and muttered, "Ridiculous theatrics," under his breath, but loud enough for others to hear. A woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes, trying to decide whether to be amused or alarmed. The hooded woman neither flinched nor hurried. She slid her hands to the edge of her hood and peeled it back, revealing a pair of eyes so sharply focused they seemed to cut through the air. Her hair was pulled into a tight, efficient braid, the kind made for utility rather than style. Without speaking, she swung the battered messenger bag over her shoulder, the strap worn thin where it had rubbed against her for years. The bag looked out of place here, more at home on a flight line or a remote outpost than in a business-class cabin. A few rows back, a middle-aged flight attendant caught sight of her face and stopped cold, the color draining from her cheeks. She leaned toward another crew member, whispering urgently, "She's still active?" The other attendant shook their head quickly, eyes darting toward the cockpit. "I thought she retired years ago." The co-pilot gave a small, impatient nod toward the open cockpit door. She stepped into the narrow aisle and followed, the murmurs of passengers trailing behind her like static. The sharply dressed man shook his head again, but his voice was quieter now, the earlier mockery edged with something he didn't want to name. Inside the cockpit, the air was warmer, dense with the smell of heated electronics and the faint metallic tang of stress. The pilot sat rigid in his seat, one hand braced on the armrest, his other wrapped around the yoke. His uniform shirt was damp at the collar, the fabric clinging where sweat had gathered. He turned his head toward her, his expression one part relief, one part disbelief. "Primary navigation's dead," he said without preamble. "Backup GPS is unstable, keeps throwing phantom coordinates. We've got a Pacific weather front closing in, and the autopilot can't hold a steady heading." I've tried every standard fix, nothing's sticking. His voice was clipped, but beneath it was a tremor, a faint crack that came from knowing the options were running out. She moved closer to the console, glancing over the dials and flickering readouts with quick, practiced eyes. Kestrel, he said quietly, as if confirming to himself that she was real. She didn't correct him. Instead, her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the chart table. If I do this, she said, her voice even but threaded with steel, it can't be half applied. We go all in or we don't go at all. I'll need full trust from you and your crew for the next hour, no interference, no second guessing. The pilot's jaw tightened. You're asking me to hand over my aircraft in the middle of the Pacific. I'm asking you to keep it in the sky, she replied. If you want to land it, you'll let me do it my way. Silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of strained systems. Then, almost imperceptibly, the pilot nodded. She pulled the jump seat down with a practiced flick, the metal hinge groaning softly, and spread a creased paper chart across the narrow desk. It was the kind of map no one used any mortgages, yellowed, corners bent, its surface lined with penciled annotations in a hand both precise and hurried. From her messenger bag came a battered mechanical pencil, the paint chipped along its barrel. She bent over the chart, murmuring numbers under her breath, her voice low and steady, as the tip of the pencil scratched arcs and vectors across the faded grid. Each mark was deliberate, a stroke in a language only she seemed to speak. The cockpit was hushed, except for the hum of systems straining against themselves and the occasional metallic groan from the fuselage. The captain read off the latest airspeed, heading, and altitude in clipped bursts, and she adjusted her calculations, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The co-pilot hovered, watching her hand sweep across the chart, marking wind drift angles and recalculating course with the precision of someone who had done this under much worse conditions. Out in the cabin, the tension was thick enough to taste. Passengers sat stiff in their seats, eyes darting toward the forward galley whenever a flight attendant passed. Two attendants whispered near row 6, one holding a notepad with numbers scrawled across it, the other scanning the faces in the cabin as though searching for a sign of what to say next. Somewhere, mid-cabin, a man bowed his head in prayer, lips moving in near silence. Others stared up at the cabin clock, the steady march of minutes too slow and too fast all at once. The aircraft jolted hard to the left, overhead bins rattling, and the captain's knuckles whitened around the yoke. She didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, almost cool, as she called out, "Reduce throttle on 2 and 3. Shift fuel from the center tank to the wings, no more than 30 seconds on the transfer." The order cut straight across the cockpit like a scalpel. The captain hesitated only a fraction before obeying, even as the automated system bleated warnings in strident tones. Turbulence slammed the fuselage, shaking the instrument panel so hard the co-pilot's pen rolled to the floor. The smell of ozone seeped into the cockpit, faint but sharp, a reminder that electrical systems were fighting for their last breath. She leaned forward, peering through the forward glass where clouds pressed against the horizon like a wall. 10 degrees left, she said, her voice the same quiet note as before. Now. The clouds began to thin. Somewhere in the shifting gray, she caught the faintest break-pale blue bleeding through the gloom, revealing the dark green edge of an island's coastline. Her pencil fell still. "Visual confirmation," she said. "Hold this heading. Begin descent at 300 feet per minute. Keep it manual. No autopilot." The runway appeared like a lifeline thrown from the sea, narrow and sun-bleached, the ocean curling in on both sides. The landing was rough, the wheels slammed down hard, the fuselage shuddering under the strain, but the bomber stayed true. The roar of reverse thrust washing the cabin in sound, until at last they rolled to a halt in the warm Pacific air. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a shaky wave. In the cockpit, the captain sagged against his seat, looking at her as though unsure what to say. But when ground crews arrived and the cabin doors opened, she was already gone, hood pulled up, messenger bag at her side, slipping down the mobile stairs into the crowd before a single question could find her. Later, when the cockpit had emptied, the captain noticed the worn manual she'd left behind on the chart table. Its cover was plain, the pages thick with penciled notations. One was marked with a red tab. He flipped to it and read the title at the top: Kestrel Protocol, for when the sky forgets you exist,